Kirk Layer joins us on WRCO Radio. He'll be officially going into the Wrestling Hall of Fame this weekend. Kirk, how does it feel now as we get closer to the event?
It still is. It's one of those things, you and I and Ken Manning were in here last fall and in August, which was, you and I talked about many times, was, why are we talking about wrestling in August? But, this time of year, it's a little bit more familiar. Everybody, we just got done with that, and then we also just got done with Hall of Fames and stuff. But this is the National Wrestling Hall of Fame. It's based on Lifetime Achievement Awards, and it's called the National Wrestling Hall of Fame, and it's in Stillwater, but there's also a branch here in the Dells over there in the Chula Vista Dome, or I think they call it something else now, but it's inside the dome there. And this is a Wisconsin chapter of it, and it's, like I say, based on lifetime achievement. And Mr. Manning and a few other people must have thought I deserved a Lifetime Achievement Award.
Yeah, that was a fun time, and Ken had planned that last fall, and you came in, and we surprised you that day. So
You definitely did, especially when I was sitting in this same chair, and I don't know why, because Ken was talking, I just happened to turn out of the corner of my eye and I go, why is my whole family standing out there?
That kind of gave it away.
I did.
Do you remember who introduced you to wrestling, Kirk?
Well, that goes back, it's kind of an interesting story, and somebody near and dear to you, and I did put that in my, my bio for my plaque, is back in 7th grade, we were in Phi Ed. Of course, everything in Phi Ed was about this class or that class or this segment of the class, and you were exposed to almost all the sports. Well, being a farm boy, to me, we only got one channel, so the only thing I saw on TV was, hockey and basketball and football, things like that, So I thought, well, I'll be a basketball player, Really wanted to be a hockey player, to be very honest with you, because we played hockey on our crick all the time. But, I didn't think Richland Center had a hockey team.
Not yet.
Not yet back then. Not yet even now. So I was in Phi Ed class in that segment, and lo and behold, my Phi Ed instructor at that time was Mr. Jim Allball. And he saw me go through the segment and through that, and he came up to me one day and he goes, what sport do you do in the wintertime? And I said, well, I play basketball. He said, I think you ought to wrestle. And so he led me into that. So, Hall of Fame guy can't, steer you wrong.
Exactly right. So then you wrestled. At that time, I think junior high was probably the first chance to really get into it, wasn't it?
Truly, they had grade school wrestling, just like they had grade school basketball, but you didn't have all the opportunities like you have nowadays, where you can get in these traveling leagues and AAU and stuff like that. So it was truly just something you did on a Saturday, one or the other. Like you say, they did the grade school wrestling somewhere, but once I started, I was in 8th grade, and so it was all about what you did in 8th grade and stuff. So.
At that time, I don't think there was a chance to really get burned out on it, and wrestling so many matches before high school.
It's a lot of discussion about that, especially some of the, more traditionalists like you and I, I still like seeing the young athletes who want to be involved in all three sports. There's a lot of merit to be said about the ones who, specialize in a sport. But, in the smaller communities like Richland Center and Ithaca and Riverdale and River Valley, if you don't have all your good athletes, helping you out in each sport, it gets to be somewhat of a challenge. But, there are those rare athletes that come along. Probably the easiest one to think comes to mind right now is Hawken Peterson from Doddsville. I mean, that young man is, he secured a big-time scholarship. And when he's done with his senior year next year, he's going to wrestle for the University of Michigan, and so, I still like the traditionalist idea, and I know you do too, that, hey, let's just play. And first thing I always told my grandkids later on, a lot of this stuff you learn over the years, and you know this very well yourself by hearing people on the radio or other places. But long ago, I think it was probably on one of your guys' broadcasts, they were interviewing a guy from out east somewhere, very highly successful coach. And one of the things he said, as far as a parent or even a grandparent, first of all, don't ask your kids or your grandkids, did you win tonight? Ask them if they had fun tonight. and emphasize the fact that they are going to go out there to have some fun. And then if you can have fun while you're doing any sport, I guarantee you'll be surprised there'll be success in it too.
Yeah, that's what they say. The number one reason why kids go out for sports is fun. That's why they get started in it, and you want it to keep being fun as long as you can.
Well, I remember that, when we were in school, you went out for stuff because your buddies went out for it,
right.
And so that was part of it too, quite a few of my buddies were going out for wrestling, and I had to compete with some guys in basketball if I stayed out for that sports with like Alden Ulrich and Terry Canothy and Leo Collins. Those guys are tough in basketball. So I thought it was, the path looked better for me in wrestling.
Yes.
That's history after that, is especially your freshman year, you have, another Hall of Famer like Norris Haddlestead as your coach. And then by my senior year, I had Gordy Marchand to step in as a coach. So, I didn't go wrong there. I got a good early start with those type of people.
You came through at a good time too. I mean, there was they had the great history of Richland Center Wrestling in the '60s, and you came in the early '70s. It was still pretty strong at that time, wasn't it?
They hadn't lost a conference championship forever. And, in regionals and sectionals, they were usually right up there in the top group. I just was. Remembering last year, I bought this book of Wisconsin wrestling, and I was thumbing through that the last couple of days, trying to think of what I'm going to say for my speech and what I'm going to do or talk about. And it was just amazing to see the history in there and see all the people that have been involved over the years, and stuff. And it's a lot of history there and a lot of good things that have, going back to the Runnings and the Kellers and guys who were, state place winners. And I still remember watching or listening, I always say watching on the radio, but, listening to Ron Dobbs win his state championship on the radio. That was impressive, and a lot of good memories from those early years. I still remember in the old high school, or when you talk about junior high wrestling, we didn't even get to be even in the room. Our workout sessions happened down in the old cafeteria because everything was full. The high school wrestlers filled the little gym at that point, we called it, and by then the freshmen and the JVers or even the third stringers, were wrestling up on the stage in the gymnasium. So the junior high, you worked out in the cafeteria. We had to roll mats out every night. Or first of all, move tables, and then we had to roll out mats, and then we had to roll them all back up and put them away at the end of the night.
Yeah, and those mats were heavier than they are now. So,
well, that's for sure. Yeah, that's for sure. But that was the day too, like you just mentioned. You had to wrestle off to be on JV.
Mm-hmm. I hear tell, and I don't know, I've never confirmed this, but they used to broadcast the wrestle-offs on the radio back in the 60s.
Oh, God, yes. That was one of our, even when I was in school, that was one of the big events of the year. To start out the year is we had the final wrestle-off was like on a Friday night before the season started. It wasn't uncommon to see a huge crowd for that at Richland Center. So like you say, real strong history of wrestling here in Richland Center, and I have to say that I feel I've chose wisely.
Well, not only did you wrestle, but then you began officiating. Was that fairly soon, right out of high school, Kirk?
Well, after I got done with school, I had an ambition to become a veterinary, so I decided to. The only veterinary school we don't like now in Wisconsin, they have their own. But at that point, it was either Iowa to go to veterinary school or it was to go to University of Minnesota. Well, it didn't take long for at least a country boy could figure this out. Iowa was out-of-state tuition. University of Minnesota was, they had a reciprocity agreement, so I went there, and while I was up there, I'd kind of say it was some of the other guys I heard about, and it's still, I want to mention a couple of my older mentors too, it didn't hurt when I was in junior high. I had, Hall of Fame, Richland Center Hall of Fame coaches of Gary Hardy and Dwight Allbaugh were my coaches, so I had heard what those guys had done with some of the things they were doing, and so I started reffing in the Twin Cities there And lo and behold, one of the first guys I had for a mentor just happened to be the association president there in that portion of the state. And then he was one of the lead rule interpreters too, And one of the first things he did for me is he let me job shadow him, And so my career kind of took off there in the Twin Cities, and it wasn't, and then because our association was heavily involved with the state tournament, I even got to work tables in my first couple of years, at the state tournament. So it was one of those things, you're already hooked on it, and this kind of sucked you in farther yet because you were seeing all these, big tournaments going on and stuff. Not like the field house, where I did that too, So that kind of kicked it in gear there where I got started officiating. Even a good friend of mine, Eddie Chitwood, came up there for a while, and we'd officiate together, and then we'd even go to the state tournament, work tables together, So that was fun.
Any idea how many matches you've reffed over the years, Kirk?
I wouldn't even hazard a guess, because you get into some of those bigger tournaments, like the Bi-State, and even the Northern Open used to be a really big tournament where you were there, all day Saturday, and grinding it out with those college wrestlers. And those were usually the tournaments where you worked harder and longer because, there were, the mats were full and there was a lot of competition, and they didn't hear such things as breaks back then. They just, the wrestlers kept going and kept coming out on the mat, and so you just kept going.
Kept going. How many years did you ref then, Kirk?
Just slightly, I think it was 39 and a half, but actually after I recalculated for all these things, it might have been 40 and a half. But, I made the choice of retiring at a certain time in my life, and that all came together at the right time, and it all, like the stars were aligned, and, I turned 60 in 2016. My first grandkids were going to start participating in high school sports, and the other thing was it was the 35th year of the Bi-State, or 30th, one or the other, and I wore that shirt in honor. First of all, we're going to be honoring several people here today, and one of them we already talked about was Ken Manning, and we'll talk some more about him too. Hey, but Dave Rudrud, was a big part of my career, and that tournament was at the same time, so everything fell together there. So that's where I held my retirement ceremony at that tournament. The only thing that messed it up that year, that it was even supposed to be better, is I was going to give out an award at the RC Invitational as the weekend before, but then it got snowed out.
Yeah, one of the few times it has over the years.
Yes,
too, so.
Yes, it was.
That's interesting. And you helped us on the radio a few times over the years too.
Well, that was another thing that got started early in my life that I really appreciated. Is I don't know if it was Ron or someone else, probably it was Ron, said, well, because that's when I came back. We came back after I got done with going to school in the Twin Cities there. We came back in 1980, and then, people like Mike Brenninger and Gary Gutnick talked me to, keep staying in wrestling and doing those type of things. And so once my officiating career started back in this area, you know those guys and you grew up with them, and Rod Perry and those people like that. But anyway, the next thing you know, besides officiating, I'm doing, tournaments with Ron and several of the other guys, and that's one thing, to be honest with you, I'm kind of glad that stuck in my heart because, I did my travel session around the state and then came back to Southwest Wisconsin, and especially when we came back to Richland Center, between Bill Twining and Ron and yourself, I got invited to come back again. So, that's been a special part of my life too, and really like to thank all the WRCO people over the years that have, Mike Cook and several others, and Dave Werman and the Encyclopedia Dave or Bill Twining. It was a lot of fun, and still is. You guys still invite me to come along, and that's been good too.
Yeah, well, we've been glad to have you. You know any of the people that you're going into the Hall of Fame with this weekend?
Well, there's 7 of us going in, and I don't know if I even brought their names along today, but the interesting one that's comes to mind most of all is Charlie Graciano. He's an official down in the Milwaukee area. He's another one of these guys that, maybe didn't do all these big, great tournaments, but one of the first individual tournaments I did at the field house in 1995, Charlie was there. He was a first-year official, and so was I, and he was actually my partner for several rounds, so that was pretty cool. And then when I started officiating in the early 80s back in this area, but Bob Wozniak, he was the head coach at Verona, and he's a Stanley Boyd native, up in that area. Those are the guys I know the best, There's one other guy that's getting in that I know Gary said that he knows quite well too. So it'll be a good group. Like I say, it's I look at this list of there's 2 Hall of Fames that people are fairly familiar with in the state of Wisconsin here. Probably the George Martin one is more renowned for Wisconsin area, but this Lifetime Achievement Award or the National Hall of Fame, I got the whole list in front of me, and it goes kind of a who's who in Wisconsin wrestling. And I mentioned Gary Gutnick, he's in there, and I thought at first when I was offered this opportunity to get in there that I might be the first Richland Center grad to make it in there, but then I got looking at the list and who went in these last couple of years. Mike Briggs is also in there, a long-time wrestling advocate and state place winner here at Richland Center. He got in a couple of years ago for mainly for all of his activities of what he did in Plymouth area.
So you're the second from Richland Center.
I'm going to be the second. I guess I can't be the first because Mike Briggs beat me to it.
Oh, have to have a wrestle off. Right?
No. I seen Mike. He can still go.
Well, I know you have a lot of people that you like to thank. Been very instrumental in your career.
Well, that's I sat down when I trying to put this together. Of who is going to be, some of the key people. And I told my wife, I said, I tried to list all these officials down, and I thought to myself, here's a bright idea. I'll just say first names, and I'll get away with that, But by the time I was writing it on a sheet of paper, first names, and I got up to 40 first names, I go, I don't know if that's going to go over that well. But the one thing that's been unique about my career, which a lot of people do most of their career in like one area. The one thing that's helped me out over the years is, first of all, being involved with great people, and like I say, I still remember. We're going to pimp Ken here a little bit more. That went to school with him, rode on the same school bus. His younger brother ran sat next by me for all those years, but then they decided they didn't decide. Their dad got the opportunity to buy the farm over there in Ithaca, and so that's history. I think they were Ken was maybe in grade school then or whatever. It doesn't make any difference. They went over there, and so they kind of, other than competing against each other, they kind of drifted out of my life. Well, then came back to the farm and worked out there. And Gutnick, and like I say, Gary Gutnick is one of the key individuals in my life, as far as he, right away he said, you got to come over here, because met him back when I was a senior. He was just coming back to this area, and he helped coach, and even though he was coaching and teaching over at Ithaca, he helped coach a good friend of mine, Mick Cosgrove, and they became really good friends, and that kind of blossomed that friendship that just kept going, and I look at now Gary Gutnick and our families, we go on vacation for the last 40 years, so that's a guy and like I say, I went to his Hall of Fame ceremony back in 2006, and his teammate Jack Ryan got in at the same time, and so that's one of them, I know another family, Gary and Mary are going to be there, and Rick and Marcia Burkhammer, you talk about people have always been in your life, he was a teammate of mine back in the 70s. Then when I came back to the farm, he was there for me. He helped move my family out in 87 when we went to Edgar, and just all those years with him and Marcia, I said to them, I got a brother and sister, and I have a relationship with them, and I'll just leave that at that. But to me, Marcia, Rick, and Gary and Mary, they're really, after the years of spending so much time together and going on vacation together, they're like brothers and sisters, and great friends.
Yeah, definitely. And people you kind of met early, and then they kind of circle back in your life, too. So that's
for
awesome.
Sure.
Is the speech written then, Kirk? Or?
Well, it's an outline, And
work in progress.
I'll share this story because I just went through the Hall of Fame. Here with, I help out, and I was the MC there where we inducted 4 members in the Richland Center Hall of Fame, and a team portion of that, went really great. And I've already had a lot of people say, hey, you got to get somebody, a team in there maybe every year, and we'll see how that goes. I think it makes common sense so that we'll do it. But one of the younger guys came up to me, I say younger because I got to, get after Dick Newman here a little bit, because Dick started in the school district in 1957. But they said, wow, here I had to write my speech out and had it all ready and this. And Newman, he just sitting there at the table, on the chair, and he just rattling all this stuff off the top of his head, I said to my wife afterwards, Jill, I said, yeah, they just don't know how us older guys can just ramble on and on. We don't need a list because those things that were so important in our lives back then are really right up front to what's going on in your life, and you forgot about what you did about 5 minutes ago.
I know it's been rewarding for you to watch your grandkids as well and compete at the collegiate level as well.
Yeah, that's like I say, I still look at, a lot of people ask me, what do I miss? And I do miss my fellow officials. Like you say, I told you that list got over 40 that I was going to thank, but I did it for the right reasons. I didn't miss some of the stuff my kids were doing, and Michelle and Josh have loved me and forgive me for that and understand it, but I did over the last, since 2016, I've got to watch. We've been so many places, and watched so many great things, some state championships. My one granddaughter was in, and the ups and downs of the other kids' careers. But one of the things we're going to do this weekend, I just mentioned to you before we went on the air, is my oldest grandson, Wes Keller. He's going to graduate this Saturday from UW Eau Claire. And he's also, the following week, he's going to go to his 6th national tournament, and he's going to try to become an All-American for the 3rd time in high jumping. And in the meantime, his sister, Paige, she's going to be rowing at the Big Ten Championships this Saturday and Sunday in Indianapolis, where Mom and Dad, Ryan and Michelle, are going to jump up there, do Wes's thing, and then Saturday morning after Wes's graduation, they jump back in the vehicle and drive all the way to Indianapolis, So that part of it, and just the thing, still got Paige in there now, so we still got more chances to go. But some of the places we've gone to watch Wes and his national championships, that's been awesome. Besides getting to see him, compete, is just, to get to go to all those places. And Michelle and Ryan have followed Paige several different locations already too. And the other grandkids, it's just fun, And like I say, kind of irritates him when Grandpa keeps asking, well, did you have fun tonight? And it's a couple of times, they give me that starry-eyed look like, we just beat Grandpa. What are you asking me, fun?
That's awesome. Well, thanks for being such a good friend of WRC over the years, and we want to congratulate you on this great occasion, Kirk. Enjoy it.
I'm looking forward to it. Like I said before, Ken Manning nominated me for this. A guy like Dave Ruder from Holman High School, both of them passed away last year in a short amount of time in the fall, which was hard to take. A good friend of mine is also from Richland County here, Chuck Rasmussen, stepped in as my coach or my captain. I guess they call it captain for my induction. And then even another close friend who invited me over after I retired, Joey Van Dinter from Wisconsin Dells invited me over and gave me a huge plaque. Him and Jim McFall gave me his huge plaque and a picture and gave me a shirt after my retirement. So it's the people like you say, the people you meet and the people you've been involved with, and even like you say, over the last years here that have been retired, guys like Ken have kept me involved in broadcast with him and I and Chuck on several occasions. And then every year I pimped Ron Fruit and now Phil Need to find me a ticket to get into the state tournament so I could still go down and visit my friends on Matt's side.
You had to work, though, to do it.
Yeah, I know. I always had to work.
Got to do some station work.
Yeah, that Bill, he always made sure that I made a few. And to me, that I could sit there all day and talk wrestling with Bill and Dave Worman. It's just we feed off of each other so much, until Bill starts getting, with his dry humor. I'll never forget he mentioned a certain colored athlete to me, and I was actually talking about the family, but he said, you really shouldn't mention that on the radio,
Yeah, leave it to him. All right, Kirk. Well, congratulations. Thanks for coming by the studio today.
Well, thank you, Phil, and best of luck to WRCO as they go forward. Like I said, that was one of the things I made sure I incorporated in my speech as being a head official or even being official at a lot of tournaments. I told them, make sure before you leave here today, make sure you thank all these radio stations that are here today, because they're the voice. That was, like I said, in the early days, even as a young kid wrestling in school, you would, if you didn't have to wrestle that weekend, you tried to listen to some broadcast on the radio. And we're very fortunate here in Southwest Wisconsin, and to have some really great radio stations from Viroqua to Lancaster, Platteville, especially Richland Center.
Well, we're lucky because we've had the athletes and the wrestlers to follow town, and now with girls wrestling too, so that's kind of added to it as well.
It's been pretty special, and it's been memorable. There are going to be quite a few people show up there Sunday, at the Chula Vista, and I'm just excited for it. It just, pip Chuck here a little bit too. I was kind of surprised when I went over to his George Martin Hall of Fame last fall. Stoic as old Chuck is, and firm and stern, that look on his face. He couldn't give his thank you speech because it chokes him up too much. And have his son Nate come up and give it for him.
Sure. Well, hopefully you can compose yourself.
I hope I can do it. Yes.
Yeah, I think you can. Thanks, Kirk.
You bet.
You bet.